The Hidden Storm. The sun was beginning to dip low over Freedom Park, casting long golden rays that kissed the basketball court with warmth. The sound of bouncing balls echoed through the air, mingling with the laughter and cheers of two young boys, Julian Carter and Andrew Scott, who were locked in an intense game of two-on-two basketball. The park was alive with activity. Joggers looped the winding paths, families strolled with strollers, and the constant chirp of cicadas added a steady rhythm to the heat of the afternoon. Julian dribbled the ball with a rhythm that came naturally, his sneakers screeching against the pavement as he faked a left turn and went right, dodging Andrew's attempt at a block. A clean jump shot followed, the ball sailing through the air like an arrow aimed at a perfect target. Swish. "Man, you know you can't beat me," Julian teased, his grin wide, eyes sparkling with youthful confidence. Andrew sighed dramatically, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "I'm just getting warmed up," he protested, bouncing the ball back into position for the next shot. The sun glinted off the lake in the distance, the heat still intense even as the evening hours approached. Andrew launched a three-pointer, but it missed by a wide margin, sending the ball bouncing toward the edge of the court. "Ha! You've got no shot, man," Julian laughed, jogging over to grab the ball. Andrew rolled his eyes, slapping Julian lightly on the back as they both relaxed for a moment, sitting on the nearby bench. "One day," Andrew muttered, "I'm going to beat you, and then you won't hear the end of it." Julian smirked but didn't respond, focusing instead on the passing joggers and the distant sounds of children laughing on the playground. The energy of the park was something he cherished, a small escape from the noise of the world. Here, in the midst of Charlotte's bustling city life, he could forget about the pressures of high school, the weight of expectations, and the constant scrutiny of a society that was often too quick to judge. Unbeknownst to him, a pair of sharp, calculating eyes watched from behind the curtains of a modest two-story house across the street. Martha Vaughn, a woman in her late 50s, stood at her bay window, her hand gripping the curtain as her eyes locked on the two boys. She adjusted her thick glasses, focusing more intently on Julian than on Andrew, her lips curling into a tight frown. Her sharp, calculating gaze didn't soften as she watched Julian's carefree movements, his easy confidence. "Too much laughter," she muttered to herself under her breath, her tone dripping with distaste. "Too much noise. This neighborhood used to be peaceful, orderly." The corner of her mouth twisted, almost imperceptibly. Over the years, the neighborhood had changed. Where there was once a sense of community, a shared way of life, now there was chaos. The streets that once felt like they belonged to people like her, conservative, familiar, and comfortably white, had started to feel invaded by the diversity of newer residents. More families of color had moved in, and Martha couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully curated world was slipping through her fingers. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment as if to steady herself. "It's for the good of the community," she murmured, almost as if trying to convince herself. Her hand reached for the drawer beside her, pulling open the small wooden compartment where she kept a hidden package. Inside it was a small, unmarked bag filled with what appeared to be narcotics, a package she had bought for a purpose, one she hadn't fully shared with her conscience yet. Her fingers brushed the plastic with a strange sense of anticipation, a wicked thrill mixed with a dose of regret. She had watched Julian Carter long enough to know that he was the perfect target for her plan. Tall, athletic, popular with his friends, and most importantly, black. Julian's presence was a reminder of everything that had changed in her world. She didn't care to understand the shifts. All she wanted was to protect what she believed was hers. And in her mind, that meant ridding her neighborhood of what she saw as an unwanted disruption. She tucked the small bag into her coat pocket, took one final glance out the window, and stepped outside with purpose. The boys were still lost in their game, their laughter rising into the humid air. The noise and movement covered the soft crunch of her shoes against the pavement as she approached the court. Julian's backpack, carelessly tossed aside near the edge of the court, was her target. Her breath slowed as she neared it. She had planned this moment down to the last detail. She knew that Julian would leave his bag unattended for just a few minutes, and that was all she needed. The park was still teeming with life, and the noise around her felt like it would cover her actions. Martha approached the bag, glancing quickly over her shoulder. No one seemed to be paying attention. It was perfect. With swift hands, she slipped the small bag of drugs into the front pocket of Julian's backpack, the action so practiced it felt almost second nature. She stepped back, taking a breath to steady herself. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made her feel strangely alive, like she was about to change the course of everything, even if she didn't fully understand the consequences. As she walked back toward her house, her mind churned with conflicting emotions. Part of her wondered if this was really the right thing to do. But the other part, the part that wanted control, that wanted order, quieted the voice of doubt. This is what the neighborhood needs. Minutes later, Julian and Andrew resumed their game, laughing and chatting as if nothing had changed. They were oblivious to the storm gathering just a few feet away. But Martha didn't know that sometimes the truth had a way of revealing itself when it was least expected. The stage had been set, but Julian's fate was no longer in her hands. It would soon be in the hands of others, those who saw through the lies and would fight to expose the injustice, no matter the cost. The trap closes. The evening air was thick with humidity, clinging to the skin like a second layer of clothing. Julian and Andrew, oblivious to the plans unfolding around them, continued their game as dusk fell. The laughter and banter between the two friends echoed across the court, a stark contrast to the rising tension just beyond their line of sight. As the last of the daylight faded, the park began to empty out. The joggers had packed up and left, the families and children slowly filtering out as the night crept in. But neither Julian nor Andrew noticed, too wrapped up in their game. Sweat dripped down their faces, their shirts clinging to their backs, the game now reaching its final, most intense moments. The time was ticking down, and neither wanted to be the first to give up. "Game point," Julian said, dribbling the ball with renewed energy. He could feel the rush in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Winning this game meant something tonight. He had to prove, just for a moment, that he was still the best at something. Andrew, not about to let his best friend win so easily, matched his intensity. "You wish," he retorted, swiping the ball away from Julian with a swift move that surprised him. But just as Julian moved to reclaim the ball, he noticed something strange. The air around him seemed to still, like the entire world was holding its breath. His eyes darted to the side, catching a figure in the distance. It was a woman, older, with graying hair and a tense posture, standing at the far edge of the park. Julian's gaze sharpened instinctively, his mind scanning for anything unusual. What's she doing here? He had seen the woman before, Martha Vaughn, the older lady who lived just a few houses down from the park. He had never spoken to her directly, but her presence always seemed off. She had a reputation in the neighborhood, and it wasn't a good one. Julian had heard whispers from his mom about her, about the way Martha would judge the new people moving into the area. She never really said it out loud, but Julian's mother had always advised him to stay away from people like her. But Julian shook it off. He had bigger things to worry about than a nosy neighbor. "Hey, you good?" Andrew's voice broke through his thoughts, and Julian turned his attention back to the game. Andrew had already taken a position to intercept his next move, eager to get the last basket. "Yeah, just thought I saw something." "Never mind," Julian muttered, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had crept up on him. But the feeling lingered as he dribbled the ball, his senses heightened. Something wasn't right. Martha Vaughn had just returned home, stepping into her modest two-story house, her mind already racing with the next steps of her plan. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, a feeling of satisfaction washing over her as she locked the door behind her. It's done. The final piece was in place. But as she moved toward the small, darkened kitchen to pour herself a glass of water, she paused. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. The hour was late, but she still had time to make sure the plan played out perfectly. She couldn't let any part of it fall apart now. Taking a long sip from the glass, she pulled out her phone. With a few quick taps, she opened a text message she had drafted earlier in the day. The message was simple but direct. "The bag's in the usual spot. Tonight's the night. Don't screw this up." She hesitated before hitting send, her thumb hovering over the screen. Her fingers trembled slightly, betraying the nerves she'd been keeping tightly in check all day. But she quickly silenced the doubts. No turning back now. The plan would unfold exactly as it was meant to. The bag of drugs would be discovered. Julian would be blamed. And then, when the police got involved, the whole thing would unravel. It would be too big for anyone to ignore, and Martha, by the time it was all over, would be standing on the other side of this, ready to take control of the neighborhood again. With a final, satisfied breath, Martha hit send. Meanwhile, Julian had finished the game with Andrew, not realizing that the tension he had felt earlier was the calm before a storm. They were both tired, their muscles sore from the game, but they were too young to care about the aches yet. As they grabbed their things and started walking toward their bikes, Julian felt a sudden pang of unease. Something about today wasn't sitting right with him. His instincts told him that things had shifted somehow, that the usual rhythm of his life had been disrupted in a way he couldn't yet fully understand. The distant hum of an approaching car broke the silence. Julian turned to see a police cruiser slowly rolling down the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. His heart skipped a beat for no reason he could put into words. "Isn't that Officer Turner's car?" Andrew asked, his voice low. Julian squinted at the vehicle, recognizing the dark blue markings of the local police department. Sure enough, the car slowed to a stop just in front of the park. Julian's stomach churned. Officer Elliot Turner, a man in his mid-30s with a reputation for being both strict and intimidating, had become a near-constant presence in the neighborhood in recent months. But it wasn't just his presence that made Julian uneasy. There was something about the way the officer always seemed to be watching the people in the park, as if waiting for the smallest misstep to pounce on. Julian's mother had always told him to stay on his toes around Turner. Don't give them any excuse to pull you in. Before Julian could say anything more, the cruiser's engine shut off, and Officer Turner stepped out of the vehicle. His gaze swept across the park, narrowing as his eyes found Julian. "What the hell?" "Hey, Julian," the officer called, his voice low but firm. There was no friendly tone in his greeting, just cold professionalism. Hey, Officer Turner," Julian responded, trying to keep his voice steady, though his gut twisted with uncertainty. "You're still out here, huh? It's late. Your mom knows where you are." "Yeah," Julian said quickly, his mind racing. "We were just wrapping up. Going home now." The officer nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't leave Julian's face. He took a few steps closer. "I was just checking," Officer Turner said, his voice almost too casual now. "Make sure you're not up to anything that could cause trouble. You know, things have been happening around here." Julian swallowed hard. The air felt thick with unspoken words. Was he being accused of something? Julian started, but Officer Turner cut him off. "Just keep your nose clean, all right? People like you. People who come from the wrong side of the tracks," he said, letting the words linger in the air, thick with judgment, "need to be extra careful." Julian's jaw clenched. The officer was trying to make him feel small, to imply that there was something wrong with who he was. He forced a smile, trying to play it off. "I got it. We're leaving now," Julian said, his voice tight. He grabbed his bike and motioned for Andrew to follow. But as they rode off into the night, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger than a casual encounter was unfolding. The trap was set. As Julian rode his bike home, the weight of his encounter with Officer Turner sat heavily on his chest, like a heavy fog. Little did he know that by morning, his world would be turned upside down in ways he could never have imagined. The fall begins. The sun had barely risen when Julian's phone buzzed, the bright screen cutting through the quiet stillness of his room. He groggily reached for it, squinting at the unfamiliar number flashing on the display. The time read 7:30 a.m. "Julian, this is Officer Turner." The voice on the other end crackled. "I need you to come down to the station. We've got a situation." Julian sat up immediately, his heart pounding. The officer's tone was calm, but had an edge to it, one Julian couldn't ignore. He glanced at the clock again, trying to shake off the confusion that gripped him. What could this be about? Had something happened last night? "Officer Turner, what's going on?" Julian asked, his voice thick with concern. "You'll find out when you get here," Turner replied coolly. "I suggest you don't keep us waiting." The call ended before Julian could protest. He stared at the phone for a long moment, his mind racing. He didn't want to go, didn't want to get involved with whatever mess was unfolding. But there was no choice now. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The police station was only a few blocks away, but the short walk felt like an eternity. As Julian approached, he could see the squad cars parked outside, their dark blue lights flashing, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The air was thick with tension, and Julian couldn't help but feel like he was walking into something he couldn't escape. Inside, the station was quieter than usual, but the few officers milling about seemed to be in a hurry. Julian's sneakers squeaked on the floor as he walked up to the front desk, where a receptionist gave him a sharp look before directing him to an interrogation room. "You're late." Turner's voice echoed through the hallway as Julian entered. The officer was standing near the door, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. "Late," Julian replied, confused. "You called me." Turner didn't acknowledge that. Instead, he motioned for Julian to sit down at the small metal table in the center of the room. A single light bulb hung overhead, casting an eerie glow on everything in the small, windowless room. Julian felt his palms grow clammy as he sat, trying to steady his breathing. "You know why you're here," Turner said, his voice low and calculated. "No, I don't," Julian said, trying to sound confident, but his voice betrayed him. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on him, like a predator watching its prey. "I'll be blunt, then," Turner said, taking a step closer, leaning in slightly. "We found something last night, something you're going to want to explain." Julian's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Turner's eyes narrowed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside was a pile of white powder, just enough to be considered evidence. The bag gleamed under the harsh light, its contents ominous. Julian's stomach dropped. "What is that?" he asked, his voice shaking despite himself. "That, Julian," Turner said, "was found in your locker at the park." Julian's mind went blank. His thoughts spun wildly, trying to piece together what was happening. His locker at the park. He didn't even know he had a locker there. There was no way. The park was for everyone to use. No one had private storage. "Are you sure it's mine?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh, we're sure," Turner replied with a thin smile, his lips curling slightly at the edges. "We've got your fingerprints on the bag, and you were seen last night at the park, alone. The timing fits. You've been caught, Julian." The accusation hit like a sucker punch. Julian opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to comprehend what was happening, how he had ended up here, in this room, with his future hanging in the balance. "Is this some kind of joke?" Julian finally managed to stammer, his throat dry. "You're not the first kid we've caught in this neighborhood," Turner said, shaking his head. "Drugs are everywhere, and it's time you learned the consequences of your actions." Julian felt the room close in on him. He had no idea how this was happening. He had done nothing wrong, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The evidence was stacked against him. No one would believe that he was innocent. Not now. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the door to the interrogation room opened. Another officer stepped inside, a tall man with sharp features and an air of authority. He looked down at Julian, then at Turner, before his eyes met Julian's. "Turner," the new officer said, his voice sharp, "we've got a problem." Julian felt his stomach twist in knots. What else could go wrong? A few hours later, Julian found himself sitting in a small, sterile holding cell. He hadn't said a word since Turner had walked out, and now he was alone, trapped in a tiny room with cold metal walls, and nothing but his thoughts. The events of the past 24 hours felt like a dream, a nightmare. What had started as a simple night of basketball had turned into a series of events that he couldn't control. How could the drugs have ended up in his locker? And why did it feel like everyone had already decided he was guilty? His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. This time, it was a text from Andrew. "Dude, are you okay? I heard what happened. Call me when you can. I'm here for you." Julian's fingers hovered over the screen, but he didn't know how to respond. He didn't even know what was going on anymore. Everything had slipped out of his control, and he was sinking deeper into the mess. His thoughts drifted back to last night, back to the strange feeling he had when he saw Martha Vaughn standing on the edge of the park. Had she known something was coming? Was she somehow involved in this? No, Julian shook his head, trying to shake the thought. There was no way Martha could have set him up. She was just some old woman who lived down the street. Right. He didn't have time to dwell on that. The door to the holding cell suddenly creaked open, and Officer Turner stepped inside. This time, his expression was different, almost sympathetic. "Julian, I know this isn't easy," Turner said, his voice more measured now. "But we have to do things the right way. You're going to have to give us something. A name, an explanation, anything that can help us figure out how this all connects." Julian looked up, meeting the officer's gaze. He had no answers, no idea who might be behind this or how he was going to get out of it. But he couldn't give in, not without a fight. "I don't know what you're talking about," Julian said, his voice low but firm. "I didn't put anything in my locker. I'm not the one you're looking for." Officer Turner's eyes hardened. "You'll tell me soon enough, Julian. You'll see." As the door closed behind him, Julian slumped against the cold wall. His thoughts spun in a dozen directions, none of them making sense. But one thing was clear. He had to find a way out of this trap before it consumed him. The fall had begun, and now he had to fight to rise again. The turning point. The cell was colder than usual that night. Julian had no idea how much time had passed since Officer Turner left. Hours, days. The only thing that felt real was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, flickering intermittently, making the room feel even more sterile and lifeless. He hadn't spoken to anyone in hours, not even Andrew. His mind was a tangled mess of thoughts, questions, and impossible scenarios. The weight of the accusation was suffocating, pulling him deeper into a place he didn't know how to escape. He had barely slept when the door to his cell opened again, and this time it wasn't Turner. A man in a sharp suit walked in, tall, with salt and pepper hair and a calm, collected air about him. His posture was confident, but there was something in his eyes that made Julian pause. This man wasn't just an officer or a lawyer. He was someone with authority. "Julian," the man said, his voice smooth, measured. "I'm Agent Owens. I've been brought in to help you." Julian blinked, still groggy from lack of sleep. He hadn't expected help. In fact, he hadn't expected anyone to come. "Help," he repeated, his voice hoarse. "Yes, help," Owens said, taking a seat across from Julian in the small, uncomfortable chair. He looked Julian up and down, his gaze assessing. "I believe you're being framed, and I can help you prove it." Julian's heart skipped a beat. Frame? It seemed impossible. He was just a kid trying to make it through life in a city that seemed to constantly throw obstacles in his path. He didn't have the resources or connections to fight back against the system. But something in Owen's calm demeanor made him hesitate. This wasn't a routine police officer. This man seemed to know more than he was letting on. "How?" Julian asked, his voice cracking slightly. Owen studied him for a moment before answering. "You're not the first person to be caught in a situation like this. I've seen it happen before, people getting caught in traps set by others, either out of greed or malice. But we're going to turn the tables. I'm going to need your full cooperation, though." Julian's mind raced. "But I didn't do anything wrong. There's no way I could have planted that in my locker." "I know," Owens interrupted, holding up a hand. "I'm not here to judge you, Julian. I've already looked into the evidence, and there are enough inconsistencies to raise suspicion. That's why I'm here. But I need your help. I need you to trust me." Julian hesitated. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The more he thought about the situation, the more it felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But the weight of his choices was slowly beginning to shift, and something told him he needed to act fast, before the walls closed in even tighter. "All right," Julian said, his voice steadying. "What do I need to do?" Owens leaned forward, his voice lowering as he spoke. "You need to think back. Think back to every moment you were at that park, everything you saw and heard. There's something important that's been overlooked, and I need you to remember it. It might be a name, a face, anything." Julian closed his eyes, trying to focus. The memories were hazy, jumbled together like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. The night had started out like any other, him and Andrew, shooting hoops in the park after a long day. The usual sound of the ball bouncing on the asphalt, the cool night air. It felt normal, even safe. But then, there was someone, Julian muttered, his voice barely audible. "An older guy. I saw him walking near the courts. He didn't look like he belonged. I don't know why I noticed him, but I saw him talking to someone before I left. He seemed familiar." Owen's eyes brightened. "Familiar. That's a start. What did he look like?" Julian racked his brain. The face was still blurry in his memory, but something about it seemed off. He could see the man's face in flashes, the sharp jawline, the dark sunglasses, even though it was nighttime. The way he had walked with purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going. He had been carrying something. Julian couldn't remember what it was. A bag, a briefcase. Whatever it was, it had felt out of place. "I'm not sure," Julian admitted, frustration building in his chest. "I can't remember the details, but there was something about him. He was talking to someone, but I couldn't hear everything. I don't know why I didn't pay more attention." "That's okay," Owen said, his voice steady. "It's enough to start. We'll follow up on this. You'll be free soon enough, Julian." But as Owen spoke, Julian felt a cold chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. The man in the park. The drugs planted in his locker. The timing of it all. It felt orchestrated, like someone had set him up deliberately. But why? Who would want to do this to him? The days that followed felt like a blur. Owen stayed by Julian's side, pulling strings in the background, while Julian tried to wrap his head around everything. He was still stuck in the holding cell, but at least there was hope now. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to shift, and for the first time since the night of the incident, Julian started to feel like he might have a chance to clear his name. But then, just as things began to look brighter, the first bombshell dropped. It was late afternoon when the door to the holding cell opened once again. Julian's stomach churned when he saw Officer Turner step inside, followed by another officer, someone Julian had never seen before. This officer was dressed in plain clothes, his face stern, his presence commanding. "We've got a problem," Turner said, his tone curt. "Julian, you're being moved. It's time to face the music." Julian's heart raced. "Moved? What do you mean?" Before Turner could respond, the plainclothes officer spoke. "The charges against you have been updated. There's new evidence. You're being transferred to a higher security facility." Julian's breath hitched. "What evidence? I didn't do anything." Turner didn't seem fazed. "We have more witnesses, Julian. More people who've come forward to say they saw you last night. Saw you at the park. And the drugs, they were in your locker for a reason." "But." "No buts," Turner snapped. "You're being transferred. And you're not leaving this place until we've got you where we want you." The cold finality in Turner's voice sent a wave of panic through Julian. He wanted to protest, to scream, but no words came. He was trapped, and just when he thought things couldn't get worse, they did. As they moved Julian down the hall, he caught a glimpse of the officer from earlier, the one in the sharp suit, Agent Owens, standing outside the interrogation room, watching him. Owens didn't look surprised, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a warning. Julian's heart pounded as they pushed him into the back of a police van, the cold metal doors slamming shut behind him. This was it. His world was spiraling out of control, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the trap that had been set for him. But in the back of his mind, Julian knew something else, something his gut was telling him. He wasn't finished yet. The fight was far from over. The dark truth unveiled. The van rattled as it sped down the highway, the sound of the engine vibrating through Julian's body. He sat in the back, hands cuffed tightly in front of him, his mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. The cold, sterile atmosphere inside the vehicle felt like a prison in itself. The walls were closing in, and every breath seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. Where was he going? What did Turner mean by higher security facility? And the most pressing question of all, who was behind this? Who wanted to ruin his life so badly? He had barely had time to process Owen's words before the van screeched to a halt. The sudden jolt threw him against the metal bench, his body aching from the lack of sleep and constant tension. He looked up, only to see the door being flung open, revealing 2 more officers standing outside. One of them was familiar. It was the same officer who had been with Turner earlier, the one who had claimed Julian's fate was sealed. "Move it," the officer barked, grabbing Julian by the arm and yanking him out of the van. The sharp tug sent pain shooting through his shoulders, but he gritted his teeth and followed without a word. As they walked into what appeared to be a high-security facility, the air was thick with an oppressive silence. Julian had never been inside a place like this before, but he had seen enough TV shows and movies to recognize it for what it was, a holding facility for the worst of the worst. The fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly, the sterile, clinical environment reminding him of everything he'd lost in just a matter of days. He was shoved into a small windowless room, the door slamming shut behind him. For a long moment, Julian stood there, his chest heaving as he struggled to calm his racing heart. This was real. This was happening. And the worst part, he still didn't understand why. Hours passed in that small, suffocating room, and just when Julian thought he couldn't take the silence any longer, the door opened again. He looked up, half expecting to see Turner or one of the other officers, but instead it was Agent Owens. The sight of him was both a relief and a mystery. Julian had no idea how Owens had found him or why he was here, but his presence felt like the first shred of hope he had left. The agent stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. "How are you holding up?" Owens asked, his voice calm, but Julian could hear the underlying concern. Julian shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "Holding up? I'm in a prison, and I didn't do anything. I didn't even know about those drugs, Owens. Someone's framing me, and I don't know why." Owens nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know you didn't do it, Julian. That's why I'm here." He walked closer, lowering his voice so only Julian could hear. "I've been looking into the situation. I've spoken with a few of the officers who were involved in your arrest, and what I found, it doesn't add up. I think I know who's behind this, and I think it's someone close to you." Julian's breath caught in his throat. "Someone close to me," he repeated, barely able to comprehend what Owens was saying. The thought that someone he knew, someone he trusted, could be behind all this was almost too much to process. It didn't make sense, but as Owens spoke, Julian's gut twisted in a way he couldn't ignore. There was a truth behind those words, a terrible, dark truth that he was only beginning to understand. "I've been tracking some of the movements around your case," Owens continued, lowering his voice even further. "I've seen how the evidence has been manipulated. The drugs in your locker, the witnesses who have come forward, they've all been planted or coerced." Julian's heart pounded in his chest. But who would do this? Why me? "Because you're a threat," Owens said, his voice cold. "Because you're getting too close to the truth. There's something happening within this department, Julian. Something corrupt. And the higher-ups are trying to silence anyone who might expose them." Julian's mind reeled. Corruption. In the police force. It wasn't just a bad case of mistaken identity or a misunderstanding. Someone had intentionally set him up to take the fall. And it was all connected to something much bigger than he had imagined. Owens hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his eyes darkening. "I'm going to be blunt with you, Julian. I believe you were framed by someone you know well. Someone you wouldn't expect." Julian's stomach dropped. He had trusted so many people in his life, but he had never considered that one of them might want to see him fall. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not certain yet, but I have a strong suspicion. It's someone with direct access to the case files, someone who knows how to manipulate the system without raising suspicion." Before Julian could process this new information, the door to his cell opened once more. This time, it was Turner. His presence sent a chill down Julian's spine. The officer stood there, glaring at him with a look of cold, calculated contempt. "Time's up," Turner said, his voice laced with venom. "You're not getting out of here anytime soon, kid. The case is already in motion, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Julian stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. The anger inside him flared like a wildfire. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You think you can just lock me up and throw away the key? I didn't do anything." Turner's lips twisted into a smug grin. "That's the problem, kid. You're not supposed to do anything. You're just a pawn in this game, and you don't even know it yet." Julian's mind raced as he tried to make sense of Turner's words. A pawn in a game. What game was he talking about? And who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? Owens stepped forward, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Enough, Turner. You're dismissed." The officer shot him a sharp, hostile glance before turning on his heel and leaving the room, the door slamming behind him. Julian exhaled sharply, trying to steady his breathing. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his entire body felt like it was on edge. He had just been caught in a storm that was far from over. Once the door closed behind Turner, Owens turned back to Julian, his eyes filled with urgency. "Listen to me carefully. I found something. Something big. The people behind this case aren't just a few bad officers. There's a network, higher-ups who have been manipulating cases like yours for years. They're protecting someone powerful. And if we don't act fast, you'll be their next scapegoat." Julian felt his breath catch in his throat. "What do we do?" "We keep digging," Owens said, his voice firm. "I'll get you out of here, but I need you to stay strong. This is bigger than just you, Julian. It's about exposing the corruption within the system, and I'm not backing down." For the first time in days, Julian felt a flicker of hope in his chest, but he also felt the weight of the challenge ahead of him. The fight wasn't just for his freedom anymore, it was for justice, and that meant going up against a system that would stop at nothing to protect itself. The stakes had just gotten much higher, and now, Julian was part of a battle that could change everything. As Julian sat back down, his mind racing, he knew that the real fight had only just begun. and the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the truth would become. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The only way out was through. The cell was silent again, save for the faint buzz of the fluorescent light above. Julian sat on the edge of the cold, metal bench, his mind spinning as he replayed Owen's words. Corruption in the department. A network of people framing him for reasons that went far beyond a single incident. It was almost too much to comprehend. But one thing was clear. Julian was in the middle of something much bigger than himself. And whoever was pulling the strings wasn't just after him. They wanted to send a message. Later that night, as Julian tried to find some semblance of rest, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. He tensed, sitting upright as the footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside his cell door. A low beep sounded as the lock disengaged, and the door creaked open. It wasn't Turner this time. A younger officer stepped inside, his demeanor hesitant but professional. He glanced around as if to ensure they were alone, then fixed his gaze on Julian. "Julian Carter?" the officer asked, his voice low. "Yeah," Julian replied cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The officer leaned in slightly. "Agent Owen sent me. He wants you to know the wheels are in motion. He's digging into the files, but he needs more time." Julian blinked, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to officers speaking to him with anything resembling compassion. "What do you mean? What's he found?" The officer hesitated, clearly uneasy. "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but the evidence against you. It was planted by someone with access to the precinct's system. Owen suspects it was coordinated to target you specifically. He thinks it ties back to Martha Vaughn." Julian's stomach dropped. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He had seen her at the park that night, lurking in the shadows. She had been watching him. Could she really be behind this? "Why would she do this?" Julian asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The officer shook his head. "Owens thinks she's part of a group that's been trying to reclaim the neighborhood. People like you, young, black, and full of potential. You're a threat to their vision of what the area should be. Framing you isn't just about ruining your life. It's about sending a message to anyone who doesn't fit their mold." Julian's fists clenched. The rage bubbling inside him was almost too much to contain. He had worked so hard to stay out of trouble, to prove himself as more than just a statistic. And now, because of someone else's hatred, his life was being torn apart. "What do I do?" Julian asked, his voice trembling with frustration. The officer glanced nervously at the door. "For now, stay quiet. Don't give them any more ammunition. Owens is trying to get you out, but it's going to take time. Trust him." And with that, the officer slipped out of the cell, leaving Julian alone once again. The words hung heavy in the air. Martha Vaughn, a name he'd barely thought about before that night, but now it was all he could think of. Her face, her piercing glare from her house overlooking the park. It all made sense now. Meanwhile, across town, Agent Owens was working tirelessly in his small office, poring over files and connecting dots that had been deliberately obscured. His desk was covered in papers, photos, and timelines, each one a piece of the puzzle. He knew time was running out. If he couldn't prove Julian's innocence soon, the system would crush him under its weight. Owen's phone buzzed, and he picked it up, his face darkening as he read the message. From unknown. "We know what you're doing. Back off." He set the phone down slowly, his mind racing. It was a warning, plain and simple, but Owens wasn't the type to back down. If anything, the message only solidified his resolve. Whoever was behind this was powerful, but they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated him. Back in the holding facility, Julian's anger simmered beneath the surface. The hours dragged on, each one more suffocating than the last. He thought of his mom, of Andrew, of all the people who had believed in him. He thought of the dreams he had for his future, dreams that now seemed so far out of reach. But then something inside him shifted. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let Martha Vaughn or anyone else destroy his life. If Owens was right, if this was about sending a message, then Julian was going to send one right back. The next morning, Owens arrived at the holding facility with a sense of urgency. He requested a private meeting with Julian, which was granted after some resistance from the officers on duty. When he entered the room, he saw Julian sitting upright, his eyes filled with a fire that hadn't been there before. "Agent Owens," Julian said, his voice steady. "I'm ready to fight." Owens nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Good, because we're going to need that fire if we're going to take them down." He placed a folder on the table between them and opened it, revealing a series of photos and documents. "This is what I've found so far. Martha Vaughn has been filing complaints against families of color in the neighborhood for years. Noise complaints, vandalism, theft, none of it substantiated, but it's enough to create a pattern. She's been trying to push people out, and she's been working with certain officers to make it happen." Julian leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. "So she's not just racist, she's organized." "Exactly," Owen said. "And the drugs in your locker? That was her way of escalating things. She wanted to make sure you couldn't fight back." Julian's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" Owens met his gaze, his expression serious. "We expose her. And not just her. We expose everyone involved. But we're going to need help. Are you ready for this?" Julian nodded without hesitation. "I'm ready." As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his community, for everyone who had been silenced or pushed aside. The battle ahead would be long and difficult, but he was determined to see it through. Because in the end, the truth couldn't be silenced. And Julian Carter was ready to prove it. The tide turns. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but also a glimmer of hope. Julian's resolve had been hardened in the crucible of his wrongful arrest, and Agent Owens' dedication had become his anchor. Each new piece of evidence Owens uncovered brought them one step closer to dismantling the network that had conspired to bring Julian down. But with every victory came a new danger. Those who had been operating in the shadows were beginning to take notice. Julian was no longer alone in his fight. He had become a symbol, not just for his own innocence, but for the people who had been systematically oppressed and marginalized by a corrupt system. As the truth began to surface, more people were speaking out. More officers, civilians even, started to come forward, driven by the righteousness of the cause. But the powers behind the corruption weren't going to let it crumble easily. Late one evening, as Owen sat at his desk, his fingers tapping restlessly on the edge of his laptop, the phone rang. The sharp sound sliced through the quiet office. Owens picked up the receiver, his heart skipping a beat when he heard the voice on the other end. "Agent Owens, we need to talk," the voice said, low and tense. It was the officer from the holding facility, the one who had given Julian the tip about Martha Vaughn's involvement. "Listen to me carefully," the officer continued, his voice barely a whisper. "They know you're coming. They've been watching you. And now they're stepping up their game. Vaughn is planning something big, something you won't be able to stop without more help. You need to be prepared for anything." Owens didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed as he processed the warning. "What's their next move?" The officer hesitated, then lowered his voice even further. "They've got someone inside. Someone who knows everything you're doing. They'll move against Julian soon. If you're not quick." The line cut off abruptly. Back in the city, Julian was pacing in his small, dimly lit cell. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The fear that had once gripped him was starting to give way to a burning determination. Owens had promised him a way out, but every day that passed without any concrete movement left him wondering whether he could trust the system at all. He had seen how deep the corruption ran. He had seen how it could ruin lives with a single misstep. But he hadn't come this far to back down. Suddenly, the door to his cell opened with a sharp creak, and a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was Officer Reynolds, the one who had slipped him the information about Vaughn. His face was taut, his movements hurried. "Julian," Reynolds whispered urgently. "Owens needs to see you. Something's going down. You've got to get out of here. Now." Julian's heart skipped. "What's happening?" "There's a leak. Someone tipped Vaughn off about the investigation. We don't know who it is, but it doesn't matter right now. We need to move quickly." By the time Owens and Julian met up later that night, the situation had become critical. Owens had gathered all the evidence he could find, but it wasn't enough. They needed more than just what was on paper. They needed an undeniable connection, something that would force the department to act. And they needed it now, before Vaughn's people moved against them. As Owens and Julian huddled in the cramped office, Owens spread out a map of the city, pointing to various locations where Vaughn's network had been active. "We know that Vaughn has a meeting planned for tomorrow night at a location just outside the city. It's an old warehouse near the docks. The one where she's been funneling money to certain officers. That's where we make our move." Julian's stomach tightened. "And how do we get there without being caught?" "We don't go through the front door," Owens said, a determined gleam in his eye. "We get in through the back, and we take Vaughn down before she can make her escape." As the two of them prepared for the raid, Owens' phone buzzed again. He answered it, and his face went pale as he listened to the voice on the other end. He ended the call abruptly and looked at Julian with a look of grim realization. "We don't have much time," Owens said, his voice cold. "Vaughn knows we're coming. She's already moved the evidence to a secure location. If we don't act fast, it's all going to disappear." Julian clenched his fists. The adrenaline was building, his heartbeat quickening. He had always been a fighter, but now, more than ever, he felt like he was on the edge of something bigger than himself. This was no longer just about him. It was about justice. It was about taking back the power that had been stolen from him. That night, under the cover of darkness, Owens and Julian made their way to the warehouse. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of the city silenced as they approached the abandoned industrial complex. Their footsteps echoed against the concrete as they crept toward the back entrance, where Owens had arranged for a contact to meet them. The door to the warehouse was unlocked, and they slipped inside, their shadows swallowed by the darkness. They moved cautiously through the maze of empty hallways, avoiding the few guards who were stationed there. Owens had a plan, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in their way. As they reached the main meeting room, they heard voices, low murmurs, then a loud, brash laugh. Julian and Owens exchanged a look, both knowing they were on the verge of something big. Inside the room, Martha Vaughn sat at a table, surrounded by several officers, all with dark expressions. A few of them looked nervous, but most had the air of people who were used to operating in the shadows. Vaughn, however, looked smug, like she had already won. "Everything's in place," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Owens and Carter think they're getting close, but they have no idea how deep this goes. By the time they figure it out, it'll be too late." She laughed again, but it was cut short as Owens and Julian burst into the room, guns drawn. The officers immediately tensed, reaching for their own weapons, but Owens was quicker. Within seconds, he had several of them disarmed and on the floor. Vaughn stood slowly, her face twisting with fury. "You think you can stop this?" she spat. "This is bigger than you, Owens. Bigger than Carter." Julian stepped forward, his voice steady and powerful. "Not anymore. You've been hiding behind your power for too long. It's over." As Vaughn was taken into custody, Julian couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. It wasn't just the fact that they had caught her. It was the fact that they had brought down a system that had been built on lies, on oppression, and on the backs of people like him. He glanced at Owens, who gave him a rare smile. "We did it," Owens said simply. But Julian wasn't looking at the victory. His thoughts were already on the next battle. This was just the beginning. The truth had been exposed, but the fight for real justice was far from over. And for Julian, it was a fight he was ready to continue.